So now I want to put Strong and Du Bois into a larger context. And here's the thesis. In the decades following the Civil War, Christianity was entangled in debates about who could be a citizen and who the country really belonged to. Christians both challenged and supported the reconstruction of the country as a white Christian nation. So, in other words, from about 1865 to 1900, there's a debate on multiple fronts about who can be a citizen, whether that citizenship is tied to being white, whether it's tied to being Christian, and whether being white and Christian are tied to each other. There are three related stories I'm going to tell in what I'm calling the era of citizenship. Again, this period from roughly 1865 to 1900. The story of Native American resettlement, Southern Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, and what we call the Asian Exclusion Acts. I have these a little out of order. I'm going to do Native American resettlement and Asian Exclusion Acts first, and then do Reconstruction last. Excuse me. So I want to look at this picture real quick. It's called American Progress by John Gast. Look at it. You see in the what would be the east or the side where the sun is coming up, signs of progress. Boats in the harbor, you can see the bridges and the trains. And then as you move west, it's not quite as light. And there are people moving west in, again, covered wagons. They're ahead of the trains, but the trains are coming. And they're beginning to farm, and they're chasing away, well, Native Americans and the buffalo. Progress is coming, and it's pretty clearly coming for some people who aren't going to be part of it. So let's first look at the policies towards Native Americans, often considered as future citizens, of people who, with just some changes, could be made citizens. But it always was sort of the next changes they would have to make. Citizenship never really arrived. It was always something coming in the future if they did certain things. We've looked at some of this already. One of the first moves of the 19th century was to move to a reservation system for Native Americans, taking Native Americans off their land and putting them on reservations. In cases like the Cherokee in Georgia, as we saw, that meant taking them from Georgia and forcibly moving them to Oklahoma. And that was true no matter how civilized or Christianized the people were by the standards of the 1820s. Another policy we can look at came in the 1870s under President Grant. This was called the Peace Policy. The Peace Policy was ostensibly designed to rule the reservations peacefully, meaning through civic groups and not through the army, specifically by giving control of reservations to religious groups. Religious groups were to come in, rule the people kindly and benevolently, and also to civilize them. Many religious groups signed up, Protestants and Catholics alike. This policy, however, was also ultimately a failure. Native American people were not interested in being governed by religious groups or any other outside group, and the religious groups found that it was not so easy to govern peacefully as they had thought. There was then a turn to education, here specifically the use of boarding schools to civilize Native young people. The thinking here was that if you couldn't civilize the parents and the grandparents, you could remove Native children from their families, take them to boarding schools, and civilize them. You can see here in this picture what the aim was. This is from the Carlisle School, one of the most famous boarding schools for Native American children, or infamous boarding schools for Native American children. And look what happens. You have the same young man here in both pictures. On one side, he is clearly Native American with long hair and earrings and Native American dress. And then he has changed, right, into a short-haired, no earring, breast-coated man. The education move went on for a long time, well into the 20th century, and there are actually many stories now about what happened in some of these boarding schools. There's a long effort on the part of government agencies and religious groups, and it was an effort that cost a lot of Native American children. There's a lot of documentation now about what happened in these schools, and Much of it is horrific, as you might imagine. These children didn't want to be taken from their parents and their culture. In 1887, the government forces a new allotment policy. They begin to abandon the reservations and begin to give Native American people allotments of land. This was a move to try to force them to behave more like settled farmers. Rather than having a reservation for the group, we're going to give you land that is yours so you begin to farm it and behave like we expect American citizens to behave. All of this is to say that none of these programs really worked. If by worked you meant both allowed Native Americans to flourish and helped get them citizenship. They didn't. It was a long period of trying different things, all of which kept citizenship very much in the future. Another thing that happened during the era of citizenship were what we call the Chinese Exclusion Acts, later just Asian Exclusion Acts. These were movements to exclude Chinese people specifically, and then ultimately Asian people more generally, from the United States. In 1882, the first Chinese Exclusion Act was promulgated. And this was the first act that precluded an entire group of people from immigrating. You can see here what's happening. Here now we're on the West Coast, and Uncle Sam is kicking out Chinese people. Interestingly, this is actually an advertisement arguing that commercial products are better able to clean your clothes than the Chinese. The idea here was that the Chinese were taking American jobs and such. Again, there weren't a lot of Chinese people in the United States, certainly not in any significant numbers, more on the West Coast than the East, but still not in significant numbers. But it was a move to exclude them as a group. Interestingly, some American missionaries protested this act. They did it for a number of reasons. Some of them were in China, and they recognized that kicking Chinese people out of the United States was a really bad witness while they were trying to convert people to Christianity in China. It was a bad look. But many of them also had an idea that the U.S. should be built upon a shared Christian identity, not a shared white identity. Now, that may not sound great, because for many people today, the idea that the United States is Christian is not a really compelling idea. But I will note that at the time, this was a more egalitarian idea than the idea that the nation should be built on whiteness. It allowed more people to be citizens because you could become Christian more easily than you could become white. Some historians, though, have pointed out that there's real complexity here. That for even some of these missionaries, what made someone Christian often meant accepting the norms of middle-class white Americans. So even though you could be, say, Chinese and Christian, in order to really be counted as Christian, you had to accept the definition of Christian that middle-class white people gave it. So it was inclusive, but it was inclusive in the sense that you could become what white middle-class Christians thought Christianity was. And if you did that, there are people who would be willing to fight for your citizenship. All of which is to say that even for people who saw things like the Chinese Exclusion Acts as problems, they weren't necessarily saying that America was open to everyone. They still had a sense of what the American essence is and what was necessary for citizenship. They just had different criteria for that citizenship. We've seen that before, right? People saying that there needs to be some essence to the United States in order for the country to hang together. In many cases, these missionaries were trying to make the argument that the essence didn't need to be a racial essence. They still, however, believed it needed to be a religious essence.